Anong sinasabi mo? Sinungaling ako? Ikaw nga kumakain ng kalapati eh. Nakita ko naman talaga yon, kaya nga alam ko eh. Naranasan ko, kaya alam ko. Naranasan ko, nakita ko, narinig ko, kaya alam ko. Ang dami mong sinasabi.
Bakit kapag ba nakita mo, totoo na? Paano kung hindi napansin ng iba o ikaw lang pala nakakapansin talaga? Dami mo namang ebas. Maganda ka ba like me? Mahusay ka ba? Tell me.
Sagot ka ng sagot, hindi ka naman kausap. Talk to my hands. Naranasan ko nga eh, kaya nga alam ko.
O talaga ba, Charmaine? Kwento mo sa pag-o. Paano mo nalaman? Ikaw lang ba may alam? Hindi naman lahat ng nararanasan ay totoo at hindi rin lahat ng bagay na alam natin ay umiikot lang sa nararamdaman.
Mamatay nagtanong, ano, face off na lang, sino mas angat, sino mas sikat?
Ay, ako hinahamon. Ako kaya si Bheanne Nicole S. Bondoc. At walang makakapigil sa akin.
Edi G, mauna ka, huwag kang iyak ha.
So, before we start discussing how rationalism is different from empiricism, let's first talk about knowledge. What do you know about knowledge? Let's begin with the phrase ars longa vita brevis, which means the art of learning is long, but our life is so short we will never know all that we want to understand. This goes to show that the pursuit of knowledge is seemingly never ending. There are two obstructions to our pursuit of knowledge. We have dogmatism, where we absolutize the world before us, and skepticism, where we deny the possibility of, possibilities. Knowledge is divided into three main categories, namely knowledge of the external world, knowledge of the internal world or self-knowledge, and knowledge of moral and or aesthetical knowledge. But what do we really mean with know or knowing? As we don't mean the exact same thing when we are to say that we are to know something or we know something. Well, we could mean first, knowing how, which is the ability to do a certain activity. Usually this is a learned activity such as learning how to walk or talk, but can be something that doesn't have to be learned, such as crying. Number two, acquaintance, meaning you know something because you have encountered it through the use of your senses in some way. But remember that this is not the same as knowing facts about it. Observing something doesn't immediately mean you have knowledge of it, as knowledge is when you have something or a statement in your mind that is either true or false. Acquaintance is simply material for knowledge, as knowledge is propositional. View acquaintance as a few bricks or blocks in our construction of a whole house of knowledge. I will be emphasizing the statement that knowledge is propositional more in a bit. Lastly, knowing that. When we say something similar to, I know that there are 8 constituent units in UP, we mean that we know a particular situation actually exists or occurs. In this case, there are really 8 constituent units in UP. Let's emphasize what knowledge is. I said a while ago that knowledge is propositional, but let's define some terms first. An assertion. An assertion is a statement that has a truth value, which just means that it has the state of being true, false, or indeterminate. Declarative statements are examples of assertions. And then we have a proposition. A proposition is the underlying meaning of what you're expressing in your assertion. When you give a proposition, you propose some sort of theory or put forward a hypothesis. So, when we say that knowledge is propositional, we mean that knowledge is essentially, built upon propositions. Knowledge is then justified true belief, as defined by Edmund Gettier, who emphasized that you do not actually know something when you just so happen to be right about a certain fact. Let us give an example. Let's say BTS is in a music show and they were announced to be the top artists for this week alone. But before the announcement, you muttered to yourself casually that BTS is gonna win, purely guessing. A minute later, the MC of the music show announces BTS to be the winner. You cannot claim that you had knowledge that BTS was going to win because you just so happened to be right. You merely guessed their win. You didn't actually believe that initially, and you didn't give a solid reason as to why you said what you said about BTS winning. But if the situation were different, let's say minutes or even hours before the announcement, you claimed that BTS was going to win this week because you had considered their large fan base in comparison with the other groups in the competition. You also considered their album sales and their music videos views. You had a strong reason to say or claim that they were going to win. You believe this claim strongly, and to believe something is to be willing to act on it. And when the MC announced the winner in the moment that BTS's name gets announced, you could then say that you had knowledge that BTS was indeed going to win. Remember that you have to believe what you're saying is right yourself, and when what you are saying is justified and is proven to be true, which just means it corresponds to reality, then you can say you have knowledge of it. Again, knowledge is propositional, and to have a justified true belief is to have knowledge.
How do we know? What do we know? How do we know that what we know is true? And how do we validate the things that we know? Paano nga ba natin nalaman na alam natin ang isang bagay? Sigurado ba tayong alam natin ang isang bagay? Kapag ba pinaniniwalaan natin ang isang bagay ay totoo na ito? So in this part of the discussion, we will study about epistemology. Epistemology, which comes from the Greek word epistem and logos. Epistem meaning knowledge and logos meaning study. Kaya pinagdikit natin sila ay mabubuo ang salitang the study of knowledge. Tama? Tama. So in the epistemology, there are a lot of notions na umiikot dito. Kabilang na ang truth, belief, justification, and evidence. So ano nga ba yung truth, no? Ano nga ba yung belief? Ano nga ba yung justification? And ano nga ba yung evidence? In this part of the discussion ay pag-uusapan natin yung mga bagay na iyan bilang parte ng pag-aaral natin sa epistemology at paglalim natin mamaya sa mga forms of knowledge or theories on knowledge. Handa na ba kayo? Tara na! Now let's talk about truth. To know it is to know that it is true. We might believe something that isn't true, but we can't know something that isn't true. If what we believe turns out not to be true, then we don't know it. We just thought we knew. Remember, knowing is not the same as being certain. Halimbawa, may kaibigan ako, si Ali. Sabi ko, si Ali nasa kabilang kwarto. Tapos wala pala si Ali sa kabilang kwarto. Then I don't know it. I just thought I knew it. I believed na nandun siya, but wala. What I thought is wrong, but I don't know it. I just thought I knew. Gets ba? Kung gets, let's move on. Now let's proceed to belief. In order for us to know something, we must believe it. People might believe in things that aren't true. Na-establish natin kanina na may mga paniniwala tayong maaaring mali. Pero for one to know something, he or she must believe it. Hindi natin pwedeng sabihing alam natin ang isang bagay, pero hindi naman tayo naniniwala dito. So although belief, sabi ng mga philosopher, subjective condition of knowing daw. Because sometimes people have different levels of belief. Pwedeng naniniwala tayo pero hindi naman buong-buo. Kaya sabi nila, dapat may objective condition. If you know it, you must believe it. Gets ba? Kung gets, let's move on. Now let's move on to justification. We identify knowledge as justified and true belief. Nangangulugan lamang na kailangan nating patunayan ang tatlong bagay. Number 1, the person must be able to justify the claim. Number 2, the claim itself must be true. And number 3, the person must believe it. Kanina na-establish na natin yung the claim itself must be true and the person must believe it. Kaya let's focus on number 1. The person must be able to justify the claim. So to justify a claim, kailangan ng isang bagay. Starts with letter E. Ano ito? Ito ay ebidensya. Kailangan ng ebidensya na magpapatunay para sa claim. Ngayon, yung ebidensya dapat number 1, present. Number 2, be of good quality. Number 3, logical. Number 4, reasonable. Number 1, present. Sabi doon na dapat kapag ginawa yung claim ay kayang patunayan na totoo ito. Number 2, good quality. Kapag nakita, kapag ina-analyze yung ebidensya, ay paktong-pak, tama. Number 3 naman, logical. It makes good sense. Hindi siya fallacious. Number 4, reasonable. Dapat kayang i-back up ng iba pang bagay. So, yun yung mga bagay na kailangan natin para ma-justify ang isang knowledge. And pang-apat naman ay evidence. Na-explain na natin kanina kung ano ba yung quality dapat ng evidence, which are present, be good of quality, logical, and reasonable. Pero dito, sinasabi lang dito na to know something, to know it, one must have a good reason to believe it. And ano yung good reason na ito? Ito ay yung evidence. Gets? Kung gets, tara na! Now, let's discuss the 3 central issues in epistemology. Earlier, we discussed about epistemology at yung 4 na notions na primarily ay umiikot dito in the names of evidence, belief, justification, and truth. Ngayon naman ay didiscuss natin ang 3 central issues in epistemology. Ano nga ba itong 3 central issues in epistemology? These are foundational questions in analyzing a knowledge. So ano yung question number 1? Question number 1 is what is the source of knowledge? Sinasabi na kailangan natin unang tanungin yung source ng knowledge kasi it says a lot about the validity of the claim. Ang naisip kong example dito ay yung kapag may mga Marcos apologies or yung kapag may mga DDS, tapos ang dami nilang claim na sinasabi sa harapan mo, tapos mapapatanong ka, saan ba yung source ng knowledge nyo? So, ayun, napakagandang tanungin muna, ano ba yung source ng knowledge or ano ba yung source ng claim nila? Number 2, given the source, what can be known? So ngayon halimbawa, let's go back to that example, no? Ngayon alam natin na galing TikTok, galing YouTube lang naman yung mga claim nila. Anong pwede nating masabi tungkol doon? Anong pwede nating mahinuha? And number 3 question, how do we validate our knowledge? In that example, how should they validate their example? Or hindi na ata abot ng number 3 kasi wala nang validation doon. Kasi number 1 pa lang, number 2 pa lang, hindi na nila kayang lagpasan. So like in analyzing knowledge, itong 3 to are very foundational. Again, tandaan, number 1, ask, what is the source of knowledge? Number 2, given the source, what can be known? And number 3, how do we validate our knowledge? Paano nga ba natin mapapatunayan na yung claim natin ay tunay na kaalaman? Kung gets, tara na!
Let us now begin with rationalism. Rationalism points out that the source of knowledge is reason. But what is reason? One definition for reason is reason as faculty. Reason as a faculty is one's capacity to not just form concepts but also understand them. For example, we do not merely just have a concept of a computer in our minds, but we also have the ability to recognize and identify a computer when we come across one, and we also respond to that very recognition. Because we know what a computer is and what a computer does, we may be prompted to use it up to look up information regarding a particular topic, for example. It is important to note that the meaning of reason isn't always the same. However, we do have a clear meaning for the word reasoning instead. It is true that reasoning can help us in pursuing the truth, but sometimes our reasoning could be incorrect. Therefore, we have logic, which is the study of correct reasoning. Logic helps us get from one proposition to another. Logic essentially tells us whether or not the premises yield or grant the conclusion logically. Remember that with logic, we are concerned with the form and not the content. Again, logic just tells us whether or not the premises yield or grant the conclusion. Knowledge attained from rationalism gave rise to formal sciences like algebra, geometry, and logic. Rationalism asserts that what we know is what we have thought out or what reason has abstracted from the data of the sense of perception. Let us now look into the philosophers who subscribe to rationalism, where we'll also get to look into why they say that we shouldn't rely on senses. First is Parmenides, who said that reality either is or it is not. He said that change is an illusion. He then, therefore, emphasized permanence. He says that change is a mere appearance to the senses, and that the reality that is a single and unchanging one is known through reason alone. Next, we have is Plato. Plato stated that only reason can reach the world of forms, forms being the most fundamental aspects of reality. And so, what we know through reason is more important in a metaphysical way. It is unchanging, eternal, perfect, and a higher degree of being, as opposed to what we are made aware of through sense experience. Senses can only perceive reality's appearances, the shadows. Plato used the idea of being in a cave as an example. When we use sense experience, it is as if you're inside of a cave working with the dark or the shadows without being able to look into the greater world outside of the cave. The world of forms isn't accessible to the senses whose objects are only the concrete and particular. Let us now move on to another significant philosopher in rationalism, which is Rene Descartes, who is recognized to be the father of modern rationalism, who said the famous phrase, cogito ergo sum, which translates to, I think, therefore I am, or I doubt, therefore I exist, implying that despite how much we doubt, our ergo sum, or our existence, is beyond question. He also said that intuition is certain, unlike what we believe or know through our sense experience, which is somehow uncertain. Furthermore, there are 3 reasons that Descartes gave for doubting knowledge from sense experience. The first one being the concept of sensory illusions. Sensory illusions show that knowledge from sensory experience isn't stable. If you're on campus and you see your classmate from afar, you'd see that they appear to be smaller or shorter. But as you got closer and closer, you find that your classmate has gotten bigger or taller. This shows that our knowledge from sense experience is often again unreliable, unstable, and inconsistent. Number 2, the reliability of our senses is undermined when we consider the possibility of whether or not we're just dreaming. Have you ever had a dream so vivid that it caught you off guard when you woke up? Descartes states that this further shows that our experiences are often unreliable. We could be deluded into thinking a phenomenon is real because we have had an experience of it in a dream. Lastly, Descartes said, what if God or some evil genius is deceiving me about everything, including the existence of this 3-dimensional world? He says, perhaps everything that goes on in our minds are just simply a result of a divinely implanted hallucination. Therefore, relying on sense experience could prevent us from attaining knowledge of the world. And that's it for rationalism. Now, my partner Elton is going to discuss empiricism.
Narinig na natin yung side ng rationalism. And so now let's proceed with empiricism. Empiricism is simply knowledge that comes from experience. Experience comes from perception, which may be understood as direct observation by senses or indirect observation by using instruments or experimentation. Alam na natin yung sa direct observation na senses, no? Maaaring pandinig, panlasa, pandama, at marami pang iba. Pero yung indirect observation naman na sinasabi ito through instrument or experimentation, halimbawa, no, kapag gumamit tayo ng microscope, nakikita natin yung mga cells na gumagalaw. Doon, gumagamit tayo ng instrument. So, sinasabi sa empiricism na kapag hindi daw natin kayang patunayan ng isang knowledge from sensory experience, then yung claim natin ay baseless. Yun yung sinasabi ng empiricism. So, sino-sino nga ba yung mga philosophers na sumusupport sa empiricism? Unang-una na dyan, si John Locke. Anong sabi ni John Locke? Sabi ni John Locke, nihil est intellecto nisi prius feruit in senu, or nothing is in the mind which cannot at first in the senses. So sabi niya na una daw nating nadadama or nararanasan ang mga bagay bago ito pumapasok sa ating utak. Tapos, pininopost din ni John Locke ang idea ng humans being tabula rasa at birth. Nangangahulugan na ang tabula rasa bilang blank sheet. So, sinasabi dito na nung bata daw tayo, nung isinilang tayo sa mundo, ay wala pa tayong alam sa mundo, para tayong blankong papel. At habang tumatagal ay nagkakaroon ng laman ng mga papel dahil sa ating experience. So, sinasabi niya dito na yung experience natin yung nagiging dahilan ng pag-acquire natin ng knowledge. Susunod naman ay si George Berkeley. Sabi ni George Berkeley, isang Irish churchman at philosopher, sa kanyang libro na Treatise Concerning the Principles of Human Knowledge, sabi niya doon na for things to be known, kailangan na perceive or nararanasan natin ito. However, impressions ay hindi naman kailangan real object daw. Objections can be created only for us to be perceived. At yung mga impressions daw na ito ay ipinapadala sa atin ng isang spirit na meron tayong lahat. Kinokontrol daw tayo ng spirit na to. At wala nang ibang mas mataas kundi itong spirit na to. So ano to? Sabi niya, si God daw. So napaka-controversial nito dahil malayo ito sa ipinapalabas ng ibang empiricists. Kasi 'di ba, sinasabi nung iba na for things to be known, kailangan nararanasan, kailangan na i-experience natin. Ngayon si George Berkeley ay isang empiricist, kaso naniniwala siya na hindi lahat ng bagay ay tayo lang mismo yung nagpe-perceive. Sabi niya, yung iba daw ay ipinapadama lang sa atin ng Panginoon. So ngayon, nagkaroon ng full circle sa empiricism or sa mga naniniwala ng empiricism. Kasi mula kay John Locke, nagkaroon tayo ng George Berkeley na magkaiba yung pananaw nila. Sinong paniniwalaan nyo? Ngayon, bago kayo magdesisyon, ay alamin muna natin ang panig ng pangatlong empiricist na ating tatalahayin. Susunod naman nating tatalakayin ay si David Hume, isang English philosopher na nagsulat ng Inquiry Concerning the Human Understanding. Sabi niya, narating na raw ng empiricism ang highest peak nito, ang highest expression nito. Paano? Sa pagtatanong natin ng dalawang question, how do you know? And what is your source of knowledge? Sabi niya na fundamental daw ang mga questions ito sa pag-bankrupt ng metaphysics, ng science, ng ethics, ng theology as form of knowledge. Sabi niya, kung gusto nating patunayan yung mga ganitong bagay, dapat tanungin natin, how do you know na totoo yan? What is your source of knowledge? At yung mga nabanggit na disciplines kanina daw ay i-commit sa apoy. Commit them to the flames. Sabi niyang ganon. Or i-reject natin sila totally. Dahil niya, hindi naman daw sila or hindi nila kayang sugutin yung how do you know and what source of knowledge nung time na to. Tandaan na sinabi ito ni David Hume nung siya ay nabubuhay pa sa kanyang libro noong 1751. So according to Hume, meron tayong perceptions na pwedeng mahati sa dalawang bagay. Impressions and ideas. Yung impressions, yung mga bagay na pumapasok sa atin with more force, more violence. Ano nga ba yung mga impressions na to? Halimbawa nito ay yung mga sensations or may lamang passion and emotion na nararamdaman talaga natin na parang pag pumasok is damang-dama natin ganon. Tapos naman yung ideas. Sabi niya yung ideas naman daw ay less vivid at clear copies of these impressions na nagiging aware tayo kapag iniisip natin, which is opposed to sensing. So sabi niya yung impressions ay lubos nating nararamdaman, samantalang yung ideas ay nasa isipan lang natin. Pumapasok, naiisip pero wala masyadong emosyon na kaakibat. Natalakay na natin ang rationalism and empiricism. And akala natin nung una na kailangan lang natin mamili sa dalawa. O kailangan nga ba talaga nating mamili sa dalawa? Pero ngayon ay may division din pala sa loob ng rationalism at sa loob ng empiricism. Paano tayo magre-decide? Ngayon, mag-move forward naman tayo sa next discussion natin, which is the dogma. Ano nga kayang laman nito? Tara't alamin natin.
Now let us sum up everything. To represent the two knowledge claims, let us use analytic statements for rationalism and empirical statements for empiricism. According to David Hume, the distinction between the two lies in the idea that if you were to deny analytic statements, you would be forming a contradiction, while if you deny empirical statements, it is still valid and possible. Analytic statements are those in which the predicate is contained within the subject. You say all bachelors are unmarried, but if you were to suddenly deny your proposition, you would be contradicting yourself, because what you implied in your predicate is already contained in your subject. As we call someone who isn't married a bachelor, to qualify as a bachelor, you have to be unmarried. On the other hand, for empirical statements, if you were to say some birds are red, and then someone will say that it is not the case that some birds are red, then what they're saying is still valid and doesn't pose a contradiction. To say something about the color of some birds isn't to say something about what birds are as a whole. You're merely adding new information which we wouldn't realize if you were just to say what constitutes as a bird. We appeal to experience.
So remember, empiricism is simply knowledge that comes from experience. And experience can be understood as direct observation through senses and indirect observation through instruments and experiments. Tandaan natin ang sinasabi ng empiricism na kapag ang knowledge claim natin ay hindi natin naranasan or hindi nanggaling sa sensory experience, then this claim is baseless. Na-discuss din natin yung mga philosophers under empiricism. And tandaan natin na kahit pare-parehas silang sinusuportahan ng empiricism, ay may pluralism pa rin sa kanilang mga claims. Hindi ito parang 100% pare-parehas sila. So tandaan natin iyon. Then pangalawa sa mga kailangan natin tandaan ay empiricism doesn't disregard reason. Sa katunayan nga, ang empiricist ay naniniwala sa reason and experience. Isa iyon sa napakalaking difference nito sa rationalism. Ayun lang naman at sana naintindihan nyo ang aming discussion.
Well, tapos na tayo. O ano, may chika ka pa ba?
Oh, edi sino mas angat?
Ay, para dyan, taong bayan na lang ang may alam. Kayo,
Sinong mas angat?
sa tingin nyo,